evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Penny Wright. I'm the Director of Adult Programs here, and on behalf of all of us at the library, thank you very much for being here. We're delighted to have a return visit from one of the most distinguished scholars of 19th century America, David Reynolds. David Reynolds is a distinguished professor of American literature and American studies at the CUNY Graduate Center. His most recent book is Lincoln's Selected Writings, which he's here to talk about tonight. But he's written quite a number of books, and I want to mention some of them to you. Walt Whitman's America was the winner of the Bancroft Prize and the Ambassador Book Award. It was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Beneath the American Renaissance was the winner of the Christian Gauss Award. John Brown, Abolitionist, was the winner of the Gustavus Myers Outstanding Book Award. Mightier Than the Sword, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and The Battle for America was listed among the best nonfiction books of the year in the New Yorker and in Kirkus. Waking Giant, America in the Age of Jackson was among the Washington Post's best books of the year. Walt Whitman, George Lepard, and Faith in Fiction, The Emergence of Religious Literature in America is another title. Several of Dr. Reynolds' books have been listed among the notable books of the year, also by the New York Times Book Review, for which he regularly writes. Dr. Reynolds is also the editor or co-editor of 6 other books. It is a great pleasure to have him here with us this evening. Please welcome David Reynolds.
Thanks very much, Penny. It's great to be here at the Rogers Memorial Library. And it's a good year also to be talking about Abe Lincoln, because it's the 150th year, centennial year sesquicentennial year of his assassination. So he died April 14th, actually died in the 50th. He was shot on April 14th. He was shot at 10:15 in the evening as he was sitting in the theater, of course, Ford's Theater by John Wells Booth. Lincoln was 56 at the time. Booth was 26. Booth was an actor that planned the whole thing and snuck up behind him and shot him and then leaped onto the stage and exited on a horse and was captured 12 days later. Meanwhile, Lincoln was taken across the street to a boarding house. It was too far away from the White House to get there, so...
Yeah, I'm going to raise this just a tiny bit.
Please.
A little bit farther than I need.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So he was taken across the street, and he never regained consciousness. He died the next morning at 7:22 on April 15th. And I gave a talk in New York on the 150th anniversary evening, and it was a very moving experience. And it was really an evening when they were commemorating him in Washington, and then the next day, President Obama announced a day of mourning. I don't know if anybody noticed, but I think a few people did. But it's really an important moment, really, for Abe. Also, it was the end of the Civil War. He was killed only 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant. So it's really the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War, too. So it's a very, very important moment. And I wanted to talk about my book that came out this year, Lincoln's Selected Writings. Just to get you in the mood. My wife and I just came back from Lincoln Land, which is in Illinois. He was born in Kentucky in 1809, and then his family moved when he was 7 to Indiana, southern Indiana. And then when he was 20, they moved to Illinois. for a variety of reasons, largely economic. Also, they wanted to get out of Kentucky, in part because Kentucky was a slave state. That was a consideration, and there were a lot of economic considerations as well. His father struggled a little bit. He did okay, but struggled economically. His family never made particularly much money. And he himself, will eventually actually make a pretty good salary as a lawyer. But, anyway, we were in Springfield, and in Springfield they not only sell hats, but you can look in many places and see Abe Lincoln coming out of a hotel. They're a little bit like Elvis impersonators, right? There are Abe impersonators down there. So, there's this wonderful library, and actually I went there actually to do research because they have a marvelous collection at the Presidential Library there in Springfield, and then they have a museum. It's a museum and library, and if you ever go there, it's really worth it. They've done a really great job of recreating. It's a little bit hokey, but it's not, because you enter and these wax figures of Abe Lincoln and his kids, his boys, and his wife, and they greet you at the door. These wax figures do. And then you walk inside his log cabin, and then you walk in another room, and you have Tim Russert. They did a film with Tim Russert doing the election of 1860, and it's sort of all in sound bites and a little bit simplified, but it's actually pretty well done. And the library is fabulous. And just walking, and if you go to Lincoln's home there, has anyone ever been there? Yeah. His home is really nicely kept. I mean, it's kind of the way it was, so to speak. And you can get a tour through there. And it's a simple frame house, rather respectable looking. The neighborhood is actually quite nice. And they've retained also some of the houses around it. So if you're there, you can kind of feel like you're back there in the 1830s or 40s. And you can get a tour. And the one thing you might ask is, where's the bathroom here? No bathrooms back then. You had to go to an outhouse. So where did they take a bath? Oh, they brought in an iron thing and into the kitchen, and they boiled a little water, and everyone kind of squeezed into this iron tub. Okay. A lot of smelling Lincolns back then, but anyway. Actually, no, it's a pretty nice house, and it was certainly by far the nicest house that Abe Lincoln ever lived in, that's for sure. About my book, basically what I did, there have been more than 16,000 books done on Abe Lincoln, which is more than any other historical figure except Jesus Christ. And so how do you add a new book? So what I did in this book was I brought together three kinds of writings, which is his own writings, a pretty wide selection of them. And then secondly, writings about him in the 19th century when he lived. And some of these writings are positive, some are quite negative, some are poems, some are songs, some are essays, some are... So I really tried to sort of represent the full spectrum of the way he was viewed in his own lifetime. And then the final section is the way he's viewed in the 20th and 21st century. So starting with Carl Sandburg, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography in the 1920s and 30s, excerpts from that, all the way up to James McPherson, Eric Foner, Alan Guelzo, Harold Holzer, and a whole bunch of other people. So I really tried to, in a way, make a one-stop Lincoln, so to speak. This is your final stop, not final, but let's say one stop along the way, in which you can actually read it from cover to cover, and I think have a pretty good sense of who he was, how he was viewed in his time, and then how he's viewed in recent times. So, and it was a lot of fun, and a lot of work, but, the main work was selecting, because even with his own writings, there are 9 volumes of his writings, and each of them is a very fat volume, so you have to go through thousands and thousands of pages and make selections from them. And in some cases, it's obvious. You don't want to leave out the Gettysburg Address, and obviously, or the Cooper's Union speech, or anything like that. obviously not. But I didn't want to just do the top 10 hits. I wanted to also include a lot of his earlier writings and his letters and his proclamations of prayer. He issued, not many people know that he issued 9 proclamations of prayer at Thanksgiving, which is more than any other president except for Jefferson Davis. It was like a religious war. I believe in God more than you do. No, I believe in God more than you do. Here's my proclamation. So I included a lot of those. And anyway, in other words, not just the obvious Lincoln, but a little bit of the unobvious as well. So, and then choosing works about him was also tough in the 19th century because so much was written about him in his own time. So I included, for example, Petroleum Nasby, who was his favorite humorist. Just before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he read to his cabinet. Actually, he read Artemus Ward, which was another one of his favorites. But as he heard, when the election returns came in 1864, he was reading aloud from Petroleum Nasby, who was this vernacular humorist. And even after Lee surrendered, at the very end of the war, he he picked Nasby out of his pocket and started reading Nasby out loud. And everyone else was going, what's going on here? It's a very important moment he's reading. So I thought it was kind of important. And he said at that moment, he said, and here Lee is surrendering, I would trade my presidency to write like this guy. And so I said, I have to put Petroleum Nasby in there. That kind of thing, things that were sort of important to him and important in his era, but that maybe today are not remembered quite as well. And I'm actually writing a book right now, a cultural biography of Lincoln, in which I kind of talk about that kind of thing. And another thing he did toward the end of the war, again, it was such an important moment, and everyone was celebrating, and everywhere that he went, he said, he would ask the band, would you play Dixie? And Dixie, that's a Southern song. He said, yeah, but it was written in the North, and then the South appropriated it. And I think we deserve to hear Dixie up north again. And he was also quoting Shakespeare left and right. And he was someone who was very, very much immersed in culture. And I don't think that side of him has been talked about enough by biographers. I think biographers are too much locked into their, okay, the political Lincoln and the military Lincoln. Okay, that's all well and fine. But all of that is informed, you see, by his contact with culture. So, and I got, some of that in here, and then hopefully I'll be able to work it up into a more, a monograph, a book. So, as I said, it was a lot of fun to do, and it's being used in a lot of classrooms now, and it's being picked up just by a lot of people who just want to learn a little bit about Lincoln without having to read the 9 volumes, or to pick up all those old newspapers from the 19th century. I thought I'd just read maybe a couple of paragraphs from my preface. My preface is about 6 pages. I'm only going to read a couple of paragraphs, and maybe expand on a couple of points. Of all the great national heroes, and this is a quotation, of all the great national heroes and statesmen of history, Lincoln is the only real giant. This statement by Leo Tolstoy is hard to dispute. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, is generally recognized as America's greatest president and its central historical figure. And what's unusual about that is that he's ranked number 1 by both liberal historians and by conservative historians. So it's not just someone like FDR or something like that, or even Reagan or something. Well, he was the greatest, but if you take the liberal and the conservative. And he's beloved because he literally saved the American Union. He saved the American Union because the American Union was far more divided back then than it is today. We think it's polarized today, and it is very polarized today. But back then, 11 states left the Union. They left it. And they formed what they believed was their own nation. And he took steps to repair that division and to bring the Union back together by waging war on the South. It's not that he wanted war. He didn't want war whatsoever. But when the South seized the federal forts, like at Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens and Fort Moultrie and so forth, he said, that's it. And he called up the troops. And it took 4 years of bloody war, but he did that. And he never really faltered in his vision. Another great aspect of him is that he was committed to a vision of liberty, and the transition from negative liberty to positive. Negative liberty is, leave me alone, I'm okay the way I am, and I don't want anybody to touch me. Positive liberty is a little more, okay, but sometimes the government has to enforce a sense of justice, social justice, and rights for human people, rights for all people. And this movement toward positive liberty is something that he really, the Civil War and Abe Lincoln really are the factors in American history that really changed that direction. And it's visible in the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which had phrases like, Congress shall have the power to enforce this, and so forth. And it wasn't like the Bill of Rights or something where it's more hands off me and don't touch me. It's a little more authoritative. And so Lincoln's very, very important in that way. And most importantly, he led to the emancipation of 4 million enslaved black people. And that was his greatest achievement. And he did it both with firmness, with power, but also with subtlety, with extreme subtlety. He didn't really want to offend. He could have offended so many people if he took too strong a stance. So anyway, that was a little bit a long riff on my first paragraph, but my second one. Lincoln embodied many American ideals and qualities. The archetypal self-made man, he was born in a one-room Kentucky log cabin, had a hardscrabble frontier childhood, and rose through various occupations to become an Illinois lawyer, a Whig congressman, and the 16th president of the United States. And this rise to greatness, the idea of the self-made man. An autodidact, he had less than 1 year of schooling. If you think of that, less than 1 year of schooling. His father was quite poor. His father was illiterate. His mother could read but couldn't write. Lincoln was very hungry for books, but books are very, very hard to come by. But he would walk 6 miles to read a book. And I'm very interested also in how he was shaped by his frontier background, because there was a lot of interesting stuff going on back there that I've been learning when I've been researching, like in Illinois and Indiana, which I'm going to discuss in my book. So he was self-made, but he was also culturally shaped, and I think not enough people, not enough biographers have sort of paid attention to that aspect of it. But he did get to the point where he could recite Shakespeare from memory. He would literally take a soliloquy from Macbeth, and if he were just standing here, he could just recite like a page and a half of it. And he wasn't trying to impress people either. He only did it because he enjoyed what he read. He just enjoyed it. He liked it, and it kind of came out of him. And at what he felt was an appropriate moment, he would come out with this, or he memorized poetry, Burns's poetry, and he read Aesop's fables and newspapers, and he was very, very curious, and he read what he could. As president, he read much less because he didn't have time. He was always at the telegraph office, hearing the latest dispatch from the military front. It was very, very difficult. He was really on top of the whole battlefield situation. But then, another sentence here. Inquisitive and curious, he rejected his parents' Calvinistic Baptist religion and passed through a skeptical free-thinking phase before reaching a pan-religious outlook that took into account both divine providence and human effort, fate and action. So what happened is that he was born into a very religious household. However, he went through a Tom Paine phase where he actually wrote a pamphlet against the Bible and against any kind of established religion. But then he actually became more religious, but he never joined a church. But he fashioned his own kind of deep religion, almost kind of self-created religion. And he read the Bible a lot, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that by the time he gives his second inaugural address, which was in March of 1865, a month before he was killed, it's only 700 words long, but it has 15 references to God, 5 to prayer, and 3 quotations from the Bible in just 7. So, and yet it doesn't seem at all dogmatic. It says both the South and the North read the same Bible. They prayed to the same God, which sounds very relativistic, but it's not relativistic either, because he said, we fought this war over slavery, and if God wills it, we'll carry on this war until every lash on the slave's back is repaid by a thrust of the sword. So he wasn't being relativistic when he said they both prayed to the same God and the same Bible, because he really believed that slavery was wrong, and he believed that God was against slavery. But when you read it, you don't feel either a kind of relativism, nor do you feel a kind of dogmatism like that. You don't feel the opposite of relativism. It's a wonderfully crafted, and also he ends up with malice toward none, with charity to all. Let us, and then he says, let us go on and repair our wounds and all of that. So it's such a wonderfully balanced speech, and yet imbued, as I said, with religion. Folksy and funny, he was given to storytelling and telling bawdy jokes. Yet he had a melancholy side that some say yielded periods of depression. And I think he was depressed, but I think only in periods. I disagree with the book by Schenck. I forget his first name, but it's a good book. But he rides the thesis a little too hard when he says that, I think the subtitle is How Depression Fueled Lincoln's Greatness. It really wasn't that. He had moments when he got quite depressed. In the 1830s, after his first love affair broke up, just before he was married, he had some kind of crisis. We're not quite sure. We don't really know why. That was in the early 1840s. And then when Willie died, his son, in 1862, February of 1862, which was very, very sad. He died at age 11. He was in the White House and died of typhoid. The White House was fed by public water from the Potomac River, and it was quite dirty, and it wasn't that uncommon to die of typhoid fever back then, so the son died of typhoid fever. And their son, Ed, had died in 1850 of an illness which nowadays doesn't even exist really. So, he had some reasons to be grief-stricken at certain moments in his life. I don't really find him as sort of clinically or chronically depressed. I think that he had moments of depression. And his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, she's had a tough road in history, because she did have a very odd side to her, to be sure. But she certainly, had longer moments of depression. She was also a very charming and wonderful woman in many respects. She could speak French fluently, and she was well educated, and she really loved her husband. She was an abolitionist, even though she was from a slaveholding family in the South, and she had a lot of relatives who fought for the Confederacy, talking about Mary Todd, yet she was an abolitionist, and she really, really defended her husband. So she ended up, for a while, being committed to what was called a lunatic asylum at that time by her son, Robert Todd Lincoln. That was a little bit later on. But, by that time, she had gone through so much. Her husband had been assassinated right by her side. She had lost Ed, she had lost Willie, and she was very, very badly treated by William Herndon, Billy Herndon, who was the law partner of Abe Lincoln, who came out and Herndon was trying to counteract the hagiographic versions of Lincoln. And so he said, well, Lincoln was never in love with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. He really loved Anne Rutledge, and Anne Rutledge died in 1836, and so Lincoln was brokenhearted all his life, and so that really wounded Mary Todd Lincoln. I don't blame her. I really don't blame her, because and there's no proof that he did love Anne Rutledge. There's no proof that he had any kind of lasting, crippling kind of thing. Oh my God, I wish I had married Anne Rutledge. Oh, so Mary Todd Lincoln was
got very upset, and then she kind of makes a little recovery. She's only in the asylum sort of for a short period in 1876, and then kind of makes a little bit of recovery after that. Anyway, to get back to my narrative, he excelled in different roles as a lawyer. We sometimes forget he was a lawyer before he became president. He handled some 5,000 cases over the course of 24 years. So he was a lawyer for 24 years and handled 5,000 cases. And back then you didn't really go to law school. There was one law school at Yale, but generally you just read a few books and apprenticed as a lawyer, and then you just became a lawyer. That's all he did. He read some law books and he became a lawyer. As a politician, he skillfully built the Whig Party in Illinois before navigating his way to the Republican nomination for president. He also built the Republican Party. So, and back then the Republicans were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives. So, kind of flip-flop, So, quite different. As president, he developed a firm-handed style that involved making highly difficult but ultimately effective decisions that led to the emancipation of America's 4 million enslaved blacks. And he really learned in the presidency how to be a good leader. But I think all of it was informed by his his humanity, and his ability to sort of charm people, and even sometimes his enemies. And they would say, oh, you're nothing but a buffoon, or Abe Lincoln's nothing but a buffoon, and an ape, an ugly ape, a buffoon, a clown, and a jokester. But he was the first one to make fun of his own ugliness. He wasn't that ugly, but he could say, I'm uglier than anybody around. He loved to tell jokes, and he would tell it at any time, even in the most serious situations. So, in a way, he disarmed his enemies. And if his enemies came to the White House, he would sit down and tell them a story. And anybody see the movie Lincoln? I thought Daniel Day-Lewis did a nice job of communicating Lincoln. And apparently for that role, he was, the people out in Illinois told me he came out there to Illinois just to get the atmosphere. And when he was walking around, he would walk around as Lincoln when he was not acting on the set. He would wake up in the morning, he would put on the hat, and just walk around. I guess, method acting or something. But, as a commander-in-chief, he helped guide battlefield strategy and made a success in military appointments that ended with the brutal, victorious hammer and anvil campaign of Sherman and Grant. So he became a very effective commander-in-chief. He wasn't that effective at the beginning because I think he was caught up in the whole thing. On to Richmond, let's capture Richmond. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. But then he got a little smarter, and he said, the heck with Richmond, let's just go after the armies. Let's go after the armies, the people, the armies. So, and then finally, the reason it was called the Hammer and Anvil campaign is there was this pretty devastating. Sherman cut a swath of destruction through the South. And, I don't think, there was no sort of violent terrorism or anything, but they burned a lot of farms, they killed a lot of livestock, they were trying to kind of gut the countryside, so to speak, so sort of people and infrastructure and everything, and finally that sort of brought the South to its knees. And it's rather sad it had to happen that way. Some people call it total war, I just call it hard war, that's what Sherman called hard war. And it's quite sad it had to happen that way, but unfortunately I think it was probably the only way that the war was going to end. And I think that Lincoln realized that. So I think as commander-in-chief, he did he finally kind of wised up, so to speak. And just a couple of, as I said, in the second section of this book, which is 19th century views of him, I have all kinds of writings, including some songs. I thought I'd give you a little sample of a song that helped get, this is called the song that got Lincoln elected, the song that got him elected. That's an exaggeration. Nothing, there's no one thing that got Lincoln elected. So if you ever hear that, it's not really true. This is just one thing. It's one element. But it's a little bit like Blowing in the Wind or something, or some of the early Dylan songs that kind of caused cultural change in the 1960s. There's certain songs that come along and kind of, and I think what this song does is it pushes Lincoln a little bit more toward abolitionism than he really was. He had to be very, very cautious about coming out against slavery because so many people, even in the North, hated abolitionism. And it's not that they supported slavery, but they were kind of indifferent about slavery. So this group comes along that was a little bit like the Beatles. Now, the Beatles to us might seem conservative, but back then they seemed quite, with their shaggy hair and everything, and pretty hip and kind of out there a little bit. Or the Rolling Stones, or maybe, well, obviously Hendrix. But Bob Dylan, I think, is a good example. So the way popular music sometimes pushes culture in a more progressive direction. And these people were they were like the Beatles of their day because they were the Hutchinson family singers, and they were kind of like the hippies. Although if you saw pictures of them, they looked more conservative than anybody today. Anyone in this audience, they looked so conservative and so stiff. But back then they were the hippies, and they were really radical abolitionists. So when they talked about liberty and Lincoln and liberty, they wrote this famous song, Lincoln and Liberty. It was sort of a radical statement. And they managed to make him very attractive because they include both his birthplace, which is Kentucky, and then where he moved at age 7, which was Indiana, the Hoosiers, and then the Suckers. The Suckers, what does that refer to? Which state? I mentioned it. Illinois. I think the Suckers were a fish, but that's the people from Illinois back then were called the Suckers. So, and he also, and in the second verse here, I'll present it in a second, but he says, our good David's sling is unerring, the slavercrat's giant he slew. And that's a reference to the debates with Stephen Douglas, who's called the Little Giant, because he was only 5'4", but he was so impressive as a speaker, and yet Abe Lincoln was 6'4". And so in the song, Lincoln is like the David slaying the giant, who is Stephen Douglas. And then there's a reference to they'll find what by felling and mauling our railmaker statesmen can do. And that's a reference to felling trees, cutting down trees. And of course, Lincoln had spent a lot of time in Kentucky cutting down trees and making rails. He'd also been a surveyor. He'd also worked as a clerk in a store. He'd been a postmaster. He and a boatsman. But he did spend a fair amount of time splitting rails. So it goes something like, hurrah for the choice of the nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosierdom through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too. Our good David's sling is unerring, the slavercrat's giant he slew. Then shout for the freedom preferring, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosierdom through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too. They'll find what by felling and mauling our railmaker statesmen can do. For the people are everywhere calling, for Lincoln and liberty too. Then up with a banner so glorious, the star-spangled red, white, and blue. We'll fight till our flag is victorious, for Lincoln and liberty too. But if you can imagine that sung at rallies, it was quite inspiring back then. And back in those days, if you were a candidate for president, you didn't go around and campaign for yourself. However, you campaigned for other people. Like there were a lot of rallies, and they would carry these rails in and sometimes even toy log cabins and everything. There was a lot of symbolism, and there's one thing that we saw in the Indiana Museum, which was a beautiful 9 or 10 foot dropping, or like a banner with Lincoln in kind of with his sleeves rolled up and his shirt open, exposing his body, and with an axe he's splitting rails. And it's a wonderful piece of frontier symbolism. And in the distance is the White House that they hope he's going to win. And they would unroll this at many, many rallies. And they would sing this kind of song. And another song, which has 8 verses. I'm not going to sing all 8, I promise you. Just one, how's that? We Are Coming, Father Abraham. And this was a very, very popular marching song. And it shows the reverence that Abe Lincoln really generated among soldiers. And there were so many versions of the song. One version had 300,000 people. He called it 300,000 people. He instituted the military draft as well as the federal income tax. He was to strengthen the central government in many ways. And there was a version with 500,000. There was a version with 600,000. Anyway, you'll get the idea. I'll plug in some different numbers here. We are coming, Father Abraham. They would say Abram usually, or Abraham. We are coming, Father Abram, 300,000 more, from Mississippi's winding stream and from New England's shore. We leave our plows and workshops, our wife and children dear, with hearts too full for utterance, but with a silent tear. We dare not look behind us, but steadfastly before. We are coming, Father Abraham, 500,000 more. We are coming, our union to restore. We are coming, Father Abraham, 600,000 more. So I went from 3 to 5 to 6, and they all these different verses. I don't know how they memorize, all these soldiers memorize, and all these verses, and they're all very wordy like that. I really don't know how they did it. But anyway, I was going to say a little about Walt Whitman, but I think am I running out of time?
No.
Oh, I'm not running. Oh, I do have a section, Walt Whitman being the poet from Long Island. He was born in Huntington, actually West Hills, which is just below Huntington. Has anyone ever seen his birthplace, Walt Whitman? It's really, really neat. And his father built that house, and it's a wonderful place to visit. But then he moved to Brooklyn, and then during the Civil War, he went down to Washington because his brother George was wounded at Fredericksburg. Turned out it was only a cheap wound, but you didn't really know, so he went down to Washington, and then he stayed on in Washington. And I'll tell a little bit about him. Because in 1855, which is 6 years before the Civil War, he had written his poetry volume, Leaves of Grass, and he really hoped that that would be received almost as a social document that would heal the nation and affirm universal brotherhood. Why? Because Lincoln hated the idea that the Union was falling apart at that time. At that moment, it was falling apart. So he affirms this kind of universal togetherness and brotherness. And he really thought that poets could be so powerful, poets, that he said, the presidents shall not be the people's referees so much as the poets shall be. So, however, the 1855 edition fell like a lead balloon. Less than 1,000 copies sold, and he had to even give most of those away. Now they're worth, I don't know how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, but at the time, And so he said, well, I guess I'll have to hope for a good president. And he said, America needs, this quotation, a healthy body, middle-aged, bearded faces, American boatsmen or blacksmith to come down from the west, from across the Alleghenies and walk into the presidency. So he said that before anybody had even heard of Abe Lincoln. So when Lincoln came along in 1860, Walt Whitman was really, really ecstatic. And he said, now the commonest average of life, a rail splitter, a flat boatsman, occupies the presidency. He was so excited about that. That's another quotation. And when he moved down to Washington in 1862, he saw Lincoln between 20 and 30 times on the street. Back then, you could literally see the president on the street. You could even make an appointment to go and meet the president. And not more than that, the president actually held what they called levees, were like receptions in the White House, where average people would come in and just shake, hello, Mr. Lincoln, and it's just average people off the street. But anyway, Whitman said, I see the president almost every day. We have got so that we exchange bows, and very cordial ones. So they would bow to each other. Once Lincoln gave Whitman a long stare that the poet felt was friendly but inexpressibly sad. He did have kind of a sad expression, particularly, I think that was about the time just after Willie died, and I think that was a very, very sad moment. He has a face like a "Who's your Michelangelo?" Walt Whitman wrote. So awful ugly it becomes beautiful. Again, I never found, of course, I never saw Lincoln, so I can't say whether he was ugly or good looking, but it never struck me as that. So awful ugly it becomes beautiful, with its strange mouth, its deep cut, crisscross lines, and its donut complexion. Apparently he had this kind of sallow complexion to his face. But no other human being seemed as multifaceted to Whitman's Lincoln. The president had, quote, canny shrewdness and horse sense. He was the down-home average American with his drab looks and his frontier humor. He was, quote, and this is Whitman, easy, flexible, and tolerant, almost slouchy respecting minor matters, but capable of indomitable firmness, even obstinacy on occasion, involving great points. So he was kind of sloppy, and it's true. I mean, he was very disorderly. That's another good thing about this museum in Illinois. If you go, it shows his law office, and it's just a mess, a complete mess. And Lincoln would tell people, you know, people would try to clean up. No, don't clean up. I'll lose everything. If you start cleaning up, I'm going to lose everything here, you know. So, and his kids would get up on the table, and there's even a picture of his kids kind of romping around on top of the law table there. He drove his law partner, crazy that way. He was a family man, devoted family man, but had an air of complete independence. Whitman wrote, he went his own lonely road, disregarding all the usual ways, refusing the guides, accepting no warnings, just keeping his appointment with himself every time. His appointment with himself every time. And his, quote, composure was marvelous, as Whitman wrote, in the face of unpopularity and difficulties. And he also had what Whitman saw as a profoundly religious quality. His foundations, Whitman wrote, were, quote, mystical, abstract, moral, spiritual. His religious nature was of the amplest, deepest rooted, loftiest kind. And summing up Lincoln, Whitman called him, quote, the greatest, best, most characteristic, artistic, moral personality in American life. And that's kind of an interesting homage, all those kind of different qualities that he sees. As impressive as Lincoln was in life, it was his death that for Walt Whitman was the crucial transcendent moment in American history. John Wilkes Booth's murder of Lincoln in Washington's Ford Theater on April 14, 1865, was for Whitman a culminating moment. There was good reason why Whitman would give his death of Abraham Lincoln speech over and over again in the last dozen years of his life. He kept on looking back on Lincoln. He was fixated on what he called the tragic splendor of Lincoln's death, purging and illuminating all. And he said Lincoln's death had an unequaled influence on shaping America. He said, there is in Lincoln's death a cement to the whole people, more subtle, more underlying than anything written in the Constitution or courts or armies. It was finally Lincoln's death that could bring America together. And it is, in a sense, true that Lincoln has brought a lot of America together because he is so beloved on both sides of the divide. To be sure, there are some detractors to this very day. If you read this book called Loathing Lincoln, there are a string of Lincoln detractors along the way, to be sure. However, all said, he is loved both by conservatives and liberals because of his moral vision, his deep humanity, and his closeness to average life, all of which contributed to those three great achievements: directing the war for the Union and saving it, reshaping the nation on the basis of positive liberty, and emancipating 4 million enslaved people. And just in conclusion, I'm not going to sing, but I'm going to read Walt Whitman's most famous poem. Actually, in his own lifetime, it was his most famous poem. And he had to read it so often to crowds that he finally said, "I'm sick of this poem. Damn this poem." But he said, "I wish I could get rid of," this is "Oh Captain, my Captain, I wish I could get rid of all the "Oh Captains" in my book." But at the time he read, he was actually in Brooklyn when the assassination, he was visiting home, and he heard about it, and he and his mother and his brother just didn't say anything all day. They went about, it's like when you have a tragedy, and sometimes the only response, the immediate response is like silence, like you almost can't say it. But then he sat down and he wrote this poem, and in spite of what he said, I mean, it's kind of like your favorite songs on your iPod, at least mine. I listen to them so often I can't listen to them anymore. But anyway, if you go back to 1865 when he wrote the poem, "Oh Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wreck. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse, no will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. Thank you.
Would you take some questions?
Yes, absolutely, please. Fire away. There's so much to talk about with Abe Lincoln, obviously. And, yeah.
I just have a comment on things in Illinois to see, and maybe you've seen it in Ottawa. There's a beautiful park with a huge statue of Lincoln and Douglas because one of the debates was there.
Right, in Ottawa, yeah.
Have you seen that?
No, I didn't see that. I'm going to go there, and I also want to go to New Salem, where he lived before I went to Springfield. New Salem. Yeah.
The more interesting thing is that local artists got together and did murals on the sides of buildings, and one of them, the most marvelous one of all, is a depiction of one of the debates with the people watching the debates.
That's
people
neat.
in trees.
Is this in Ottawa?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something to see.
Wow. I'll definitely have to go to Ottawa, yeah. Because when you go to Illinois, you really do feel it. And now, it's true that we were there at a certain time. It was the 150th anniversary, and it was the reenactment of his funeral. And that's one reason why the Lincoln reenactor was there. Of course, he was just there kind of celebrating and everything. But in the funeral, what happened is that there was a long cortege or procession down Main Street in Springfield, and with his horse Bob, empty, the empty saddle, led by two African Americans whom he had known and had been very close to when he lived in Springfield. So, and then if you go to Lincoln's tomb, which is just on the outskirts of, have you been there? That's a beautiful obelisk with a statue of Lincoln, and then a head of Lincoln, and then statuettes of Lincoln, of Civil War scenes. It's an incredible place to go, it really is, yeah. I mean, you don't think of Springfield, Illinois as being whatever too thrown. No offense to people from Springfield. Yeah.
There's a wonderful seated Lincoln in front of the Essex County Courthouse in downtown Newark, which is a black city.
Yeah.
It's a very impressive statue.
I'll have to check that one out too. Yeah.
Just two things. One is a question for you because it's so generally acknowledged how thoroughly Lincoln represented the best of the ideals of the American Union, of the concept of the American government, and yet maybe you can just tell us a little bit more about during his presidency how he was seen publicly, not quite as glowingly as we now see him so many years later.
Yeah. Without letting the cat in the bag, one of the things I'm going to talk about in my new book, which is sort of like a cultural biography, is that he compared himself, and he was often compared to Blondin. Now, Blondin was a tightrope walker who went across Niagara Falls with people on his back and everything like that. And he said, I'm just like Blondin. And everyone said, yeah, I never heard cartoons of him as Blondin. But that's the way it was, and he was savagely attacked in the North as well, obviously in the South, but attacked as being much too liberal by Democrats in the North who were called Copperheads. And also he was attacked as being a tyrant. Why? Because during the war he had to suspend civil liberties for a while. He had to suspend habeas corpus for a while, freedom of the press, to squelch disloyal newspapers and so forth. So he really had to kind of push the limit of the Constitution. Now, the Constitution does allow, in moments of rebellion or invasion, for the president to take extraordinary powers, but he really was portrayed as a tyrant and as a so-called, I don't want to use the word N worshiper by certain conservative, and there were a lot of conservatives in the North. But he did have enough support and enough love of his father Abraham and also enough tact and enough eloquence to be able to be reelected. Although in the second election in 1864, 3 months before the election, about 2.5 months before, he actually distributed a letter to his cabinet saying, I don't think I'm going to be reelected. So he really didn't, he thought that the tide was moving against him. But then Sherman took over Atlanta, and Sherman really sort of was sweeping through Georgia, and there's nothing like military victory to buoy up a presidency, and then kind of was elected as a result of that. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite story about Lincoln, humorous story about him, or one he would tell?
Oh boy, well, he would often. I've read so many of them that I've kind of forgotten all of them. He was just sort of dropping stories left and right. He joked a lot about his own ugliness, and he talked about. I was just reading one today in 1840, when he was in the Illinois legislature. And his enemies, the Democrats, had said, well, our position on internal improvements, and that was like infrastructure, we may be a little weak in the legs, they use that kind of expression, but we're very strong in the heart and the head here in our moral principle. And so in public he got up and told this anecdote about an Irishman who got so drunk that he believed that he had cork legs that ran away with him, or something like that. And when I tell it, it's no good, but when he told it, it was very funny. That's usually true about Lincoln's stories. You can read them and they're kind of like that. You read it and it doesn't even sound that funny, but apparently it was absolutely hilarious to people. And he did a lot of funny things, like once he tried to prevent a quorum so a certain bill wouldn't pass, and to prevent a quorum, there had to be a certain number of people in the room or a certain number of people absent. And to make more people absent, he and a couple of other Republicans jumped out the window. Jumped out the window so there wouldn't be a quorum in the room. Unfortunately, and so the joke was that Lincoln's legs were so long that he didn't have to jump, right? I mean, and actually, it was defeated because the Speaker of the House just counted him there anyway. They counted him, or he didn't count his vote. I mean, he just told all kinds of stories, and some of them were a little bit bawdy. There's one story he loved to tell about a preacher who got up in front, and his first statement was, "I am the Christ, come again," and which was actually not too uncommon thing to say back then. In fact, his rival Peter Cartwright in 1846, who had been a Methodist preacher, often said that, "I am the Christ, come again." And anyway, but then a lizard, little blue lizard, ran up the legs of this preacher, and so the preacher took off his trousers, and then the lizard went up farther behind the guy's back, and so he took off his shirt. And then a lady in the audience yelled, "If you're the Christ, come again. I'm giving up the Bible." Again, well, maybe not quite Jimmy Fallon, but back then it kind of hit a chord, I think. But yeah, there are a lot of anecdotes. And he said, "I'm only a retail dealer," which meant I only tell other people's jokes. He would say, "Back home, this happened," but about 80% of his jokes were from comic books, storybooks that he read, and they just adapted them to his own. And he said, I only retell stories that I hear. That's all I know." Yeah.
You hear so much. I mean, obviously the emancipation of the slaves and his attitude towards African Americans was always at the forefront of discussion. You never hear anything about his attitude towards like the Native American populations. Is there much to know about that? Did people even think about that at the time?
He was a little patronizing. The attitude toward Native American. His grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, his namesake, had been killed by a Native American in Kentucky, and when his grandfather was killed, one of his sons, who was Lincoln's father, actually picked up a rifle and shot the Indian. So there was a little tension there in the background. And during Lincoln's presidency, there was an uprising of the Sioux Indians in the West, and Lincoln had to suppress the uprising, and he actually created the largest mass hanging in American history when he had 32 Native Americans hanged, all together. They were hanged as rebels. However, that sounds a little worse than it actually was, because he winnowed out only the natives that he really thought were guilty. I mean, he kind of very carefully went through the case, so we have to be a little bit careful about saying that was just horrible. It wasn't kind of like the My Lai massacre or something like that. I mean, but at the same time, I mean, I really can't say that he had a vision about Native Americans that was quite as comprehensive as it was about African Americans. There's a speech I give in here in which he's talking to I forget the chief who comes to Washington, and it's a little bit condescending, like, we white people are like your fathers, and you are like our children, and which is kind of typical of that era. And we know that the earth is a globe, and whereas you just live by hunting, we live by tilling and manufacturing and everything. So, yeah. But, I mean, Lincoln was hardly perfect, and even his statements about African Americans sometimes were a little conservative, although I think a lot of those came early in his career. And he said some of those publicly because they knew that they would hit a chord with the more conservative members of his voters. So, and African Americans who met him personally found him extremely kind. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and other people who met him in the White House really found him very, very kind and unprejudiced and all that. And, yeah.
Did he have bodyguards or anything?
Well, his wife feared for his life, and his mother his stepmother, actually, his mother died when he was dead. His stepmother said, "I'm sorry that he was elected because I think he's going to get killed." And when he was killed, her only reaction was, I knew it was going to happen. I knew this was going to happen. And she was obviously very sad. I knew it, and his wife kind of knew it too, because he had one bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, who told him on that night, April 14th, don't you dare go out, because he loved to go to the theater. He went to the theater 100 times during the presidency. He loved to go out to the theater. He said, don't go out tonight, okay? I'm not in town. This sort of hurly-burly bodyguard. But he went out anyway. All he left was a little messenger boy out in front of the booth where he was sitting there. There was no Secret Service at that time. Now, when he went around town, he had a cavalry around him. But a year before he was killed, someone took a pot shot at him in the street and knocked his hat off. The bullet went right through his hat. So, and he said, someday I'm probably going to get killed. He figured he'd get killed. He got all kinds of letters threatening assassination, and he had a little assassination file on his desk. Letters threatening assassination. But he had kind of a stoical attitude toward everything. He just said, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, whether I have a bodyguard next to me or not. Was there another question?
I think there was.
Yeah.
I had a question about how you personally became so interested in Lincoln.
How did I?
Was it something that began when you were in college? Or?
No, I think I've been kind of buzzing around Lincoln, almost like a bumblebee. If you don't mind my comparing myself to a bee, but for many years, because I wrote a book on Walt Whitman, I wrote a book on John Brown, I wrote a book on Harry Beecher Stowe, and I said, why don't I get to the very heart of it all? Abe Lincoln. It was kind of daunting. But it's been a lot of fun. And I see that Lincoln in many ways was connected to people like John Brown and Walt Whitman and all these other people. So I'm really interested in how all these different streams, cultural streams, kind of feed into him. So I think in a way it was kind of a culmination for me of my interest. I'm kind of trapped in the 19th century, Love being back there. That's kind of my thing. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Penny.